Um, okay, so welcome everybody to our stream. We're bringing in our panelists today to talk about their views on what.
Okay, so welcome everybody.
Feedback on what our society might look like when it's moved past police. First, we have Professor Robert Vargas. I'm just going to read off his description. Professor Vargas's research examines how laws, politics, and bureaucracies shape the conditions of cities. With a particular focus on violence and healthcare, he has written a book, Wounded City, Violent Turf Wars in a Chicago Barrio. And earlier we talked and you were giving your 15 minutes of summary on sort of the views that you had been exploring around the topic of a society past police. You mentioned things like social control, carceral logics, and the logics of capitalism. Would you be willing to give a quick summary again, and then we can go into that in a little more depth?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be part of what's a really important effort, because I think that it's important to recognize that, the US hasn't had a time period when the police didn't exist, or some form of policing or social control of that such didn't exist. And so to try and think about advancing abolitionist movements, you have to apply some imagination and experimentation to think through what society is going to look like if that goal is reached. And so what I'm going to share are just some principles and some ideas that you don't necessarily have to have answers to, but they're ideas to wrestle with as you're trying to imagine a society without policing as we know it. I would encourage all of you to think as unconstrained as possible and to apply your imaginations vigorously. And I think the first principle to really grapple with is to recognize that the abolition of policing does not necessarily mean the abolition of social control. And so these are two fundamentally different concepts. Policing is a manifestation of a particular form of social control. And I think that one of the most common critiques of this perspective and the kinds of exercises that your group is doing is to think that, oh, okay, well, some chaos or lawlessness is going to spring up if you get rid of the police. Well, the first task of imagining a society post-police is thinking about what are going to be the alternative forms of social control. In other words, what will the society do to address the quote-unquote free rider problem, to deal with how will society define deviance. And I think along those lines, it's important to recognize that so that's the first principle. Second principle is to recognize that when you think about the history of policing and history of social control in the US, a lot of it has been founded on the idea of protecting private property. And so you look at the history of policing and how they arose or in the era of slavery to hunt fugitive slaves, to quell labor movements in the 1800s. The second big question to think about in this exercise is, what is the goal orientation of this new form of social control that you want to put forth? It's clear that the understanding that that society is currently operating under is one that is very much influenced by the ideals and principles of capitalism, which prioritizes the protection of private property first. And so if you're going to think about reorienting a system of social control, then you have to think about what is that guiding value orientation. A third important principle is having an idea of what is justice. So for someone who is wronged, what would a system or a group or infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, whatever you devise, how would justice be administered? A fourth principle to grapple with is knowledge. How will you know when your new system is just or unjust? Who will you give voice to? Who will have a seat at the table for defining this value orientation or this new definition of justice? These are all important parameters to think through. And then lastly, whenever societies undergo major transitions, there are always members of the previous version of society, if you want to call it that, who try to somehow bring society back to what it used to be like, right? I mean, you see this from the transition from the global economy, from mercantilism to capitalism. You see this, right, from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, right? And so I think another important thing to think about as you're imagining something moving forward is to also look in the rearview mirror and look around you, because there will be folks who will be trying to actively delegitimize just like we're seeing right now in the efforts to delegitimize the abolition movement. There are going to be efforts to delegitimize whatever alternative structure or vision you put forth. And I think one of the most clear examples of this kind of practice occurs in Chicago with respect to the nonprofit violence prevention industry. So as an alternative to police, some organizations employ former gang members to go out and settle disputes amongst youth in order to keep police as far away from this process so that violence can be prevented without invoking the criminal justice system. Well, there have been instances where a former gang member employed by a nonprofit organization was arrested on drug charges or arrested on domestic violence charges or something like this. And so advocates of the status quo or of police or of government will point and say, see, look, you guys are hiring crooks. This system is just as unjust, or you're even more unjust than this policing system, right? And, there's all sorts of, contradictions in that kind of argument. So, but bracket that, because the broader point is that any vision that you try and put forth is going to encounter resistance from folks who are going to try and delegitimize that. And so this is an important thing to think through, because it relates to the question of how do you decide who gets a seat at the table for defining things like justice, for contesting the knowledge that your new society or system is going to put forward. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Vargas. That's a lot to think about. One point that you brought up in the very beginning that I think is great to reiterate is this idea that there will be different varieties on the way that this social control is occurring, and that police is just one of them. Like you mentioned, a lot of people will say, oh, does that mean, any crimes will just continue? Does defunding the police mean that there's just, no budget for police and that crime will just abound? I was telling my mother about this event, and she was saying that she saw this advertisement on TV, because of course she still watches TV, and it was a Trump advertisement where someone was calling a police station, and it just went to a voicemail because this alternative world police station has no budget. And they were saying, press 1 for this sort of crime, press 2 for this sort of crime. And it just went to voicemail. And they were like, we'll get back to you in 5 days. So one point that you brought up.
Clever ad. It's a clever ad.
It is a very clever ad. But the funny thing is that it's kind of like not really getting to the point of what people are saying when they're saying, for example, defund the police, or we need to move to a system past police. It's not about having no ways of regulating people or bringing people to justice. It's more about finding the system that's not based on slavery, based on these super capitalistic logics. And I was wondering if you had any models of social control that you knew of that you could speak a little more about besides policing.
Sure. Before I go into some models, I think, so what you just said raises questions of the importance to define what is protection, what is safety, and also what is a threat, right? But in terms of models, it's tough because there's a difference between thinking about a policy model and a programmatic model versus, I guess, a template of informal social order or social control. And so I can talk about policy models, but I really think that they're too closely aligned to what we currently have,
Right.
that I'll just speak to some of the more informal models. And the way that this is usually described is like, in the literature and urban sociology, it's called informal social organization, which is the idea of cohesion, trust, shared expectations emerging in the absence of formal organizations, in the absence of government, that occurs usually amongst residents in a community. And in one of my chapters in my book on violence in a Chicago neighborhood, I describe an informal mode of social organization where you had open communication channels between members of churches, of schools, of nonprofit organizations, of residents, and of members and of gang members. And as a way to try and reduce violence, not necessarily reduce crime, but reduce violence, because those are two different things. The government defines what a crime is. But in order to keep peace, an informal arrangement emerged between all of these different actors where they agreed, you know what, we're not going to involve the police. We're just going to intervene so that whenever there's a conflict between either gang members or non-gang members, and it's important to remember that plenty of non-gang members also engage in violence. This is not just a gang thing, right? That you have some legitimate member of the community who is seen as legitimate by the actors with the grievances that comes in and settles the dispute. And that I feel like is the model of, it's a model of social control that I think of most, because it's more from the ground up than it is from the top down, that it's based in a community's knowledge of one another and respect for one another. And it's not imposed from an outsider. And I can forward a few other examples of this kind of phenomenon, because there's a lot of these kinds of dynamics that are described in ethnographies. And I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm sure that there are folks who study like indigenous groups that uncover other systems of enforcing social norms that involve, for example, like a village elder coming in and intervening and determining what is the right restitution for a wrongdoing, an act of wrongdoing committed by one community member to another. And so those are the ways that I would Those are the those are the models that come to mind when I think about an alternative.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Our time is flying by. We've got 5 more minutes. I really wanted to ask you about the thing you said right before you answered the question, which was protection, who that's for. I think a lot of people who are worried about either defunding or dissolving the police force feel that they are currently being protected by the police force. So could you just talk a little bit more about protection, what you're bringing up?
Yeah, I think that there's so much to unpack, but I think that what compels people to feel that they need protection is the production of a narrative of a threatening kind of person or a threat that's out there that they need protection from, right? And what the US historically has done and continues to do is to manufacture the creation of a threat that compels people to feel that they need the state's protection. And so this is a theoretical framework that's called governing through crime. And so it's a common tactic for governments to compel citizens to feel like they need the state, like they need the government, by producing the image of a threatening person that they need protection from. And that's a way that governments or power structures justify their existence to people. And so this is related, I guess, to this task and this exercise, is that whatever, it could be a government structure that you think of, it could be one that doesn't involve governments, whatever you want to call it, the organization, the social organization that you're going to imagine, you have to think about an alternative basis from which to govern. One that justifies your existence, not on your ability to protect people from a manufactured threat, but on some other basis.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I have been thinking a lot about Asian American identity right now with the protests. And one thing that people often cite is Koreatown, right, where the sort of Korean population and the Black population were sort of turned against each other and told that like each other is the threat. And it's such an interesting perspective, because I think once we move on from that model, we'll really be able to begin to have a model for something more akin to solidarity, something where the racial divides are kind of not set aside, but kind of faded in the background of a common mission for society and for justice.
Yeah.
Which, again, last 2 minutes, but I'd love to hear your thoughts more on like different models of justice and what justice might look like.
I mean, I wish I had the time to do the kind of these imaginative exercises that you all are doing, because I'm too busy trying to put out the world's fires. But the short answer is I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I guess I can end with kind of like one more thought to reflect on, which is just this question of whether societies have legitimate threats. I mean, I think that yes, the answer is that societies do have a legitimate threat, but the question of how do you go about defining that is a really, really tricky one. And I think that I would encourage folks to not shy away from trying to define this, and instead just run with something, because I think at the end of the day, what the abolition movement is about is providing historically disenfranchised, oppressed groups the autonomy to answer these questions for themselves and to deal with the imperfections of their proposed system on their own terms as opposed to someone else's. So instead of, I mean, there are folks who argue for a utopic vision. I'm a bit more of a realist. I mean, these kinds of questions around justice are going to continue to persist, and however the system looks. And I would just encourage folks to just run with it and see where it goes.
Thank you so much, Professor Vargas. That'll wrap up our first panel for the day. And these are big questions, these are big thoughts. There's, of course, so much to say, but I really encourage you all as participants to really be experimental. Again, don't shy away from the big questions because that's what the design challenge is here for. And ultimately, once you've tackled the really difficult things, then you can begin to whittle it down and really narrow down on something that might be, dare I say, practical. But thank you so much, Professor Vargas.
Sounds good. Good luck.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, we're all here, right?
Hello. Yeah.
This is
awesome. All right, I'll just begin by introducing myself. My name is Nora Mean. I'm a rising sophomore at the University of Chicago, and I'm also a member of the Coded Design Collective.
And hi everyone, my name is Hamid Fernandez, and I'm a third year at the University of Chicago. And I can introduce Patrick. Today we have Patrick Jagoda, who is a professor of cinema and media studies at the University of Chicago.
And we're also joined by Ashlyn Sparrow, who's the assistant director of the Western Game Lab.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So I guess we have about like half an hour, so we'll just get right into the questions. So for both of y'all, Patrick and Ash, how does your background in game design uniquely position you to imagine a future without police?
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and start?
What's up?
You want to go ahead and start first?
Sure. So Ashley and I together work on a bunch of political games and games with social dimensions, but I'll actually say something a little bit more general. So as a game designer, I think a great deal about systems and how people act within systems, right? So game is basically a formal system. It sometimes includes an economy, a culture, a world to explore. It forms a possibility space that has both constraints and enables actions. So when thinking about a future without police, you're being challenged to move beyond a critique of police brutality, racism, or ineffectiveness. Saying no is really important, and saying no, this isn't working, is really hard. But imagining something different is even more difficult, right? So I would just say that as a game designer, I know that for anyone working on these projects, these experiments aren't going to be perfect, and some things just won't work, right? There's going to be ambivalence, and change takes generations. So that would be my starting place. And I think also as a game designer, you're helping us think about how we might act in a post-police world, right? So I would be asking myself in this context, how do you use gameplay to imagine civilian-led crisis intervention teams made up of doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, teachers, for instance, right? Or what does decriminalization of nonviolent crimes look like at a national or transnational scale? Or what would a player have to do to make direct democracy imaginable at a community level? In a way, as a designer, right, you're not just creating a fun game, you're experimenting with an alternative set of rules, policies, and cultures. So I think this way of doing things that Ashlyn and I engage in accords very closely with the idea of imagining other kinds of systems without police.
That was awesome. And then, do you have like any suggestions on like where participants can begin when like tackling these like interactive like post-police worlds?
I would say start with one idea. I know that, we're trying to deal with this idea of defunding the police, but it means so many different things. Like Patrick gave a really great list of all the things that it could mean. And, we all want to change the world, and the world is full of interconnected systems. But if you have a game, right, and this is a design challenge, and it's only going to last for 2 weeks, right? So you would only want to stick with one idea, right? What is the one thing that you want to see? If you want to imagine a world where there's no police in a community, and the community is, working with one another to help, think through social problems or criminal issues, then maybe that's the idea that you just stick with, right? And that's the only thing that you want to explore, even though defunding the police can mean 20 to 100 different things. Stick with one idea and then just work through that.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would add just as another piece of advice to think in medium-specific ways, right? So your narrative matters, your graphics matter, but also think about what a player is actually doing in your game, right? We're seeing some representational changes to mainstream games. So like maybe a really loud example was Fortnite removing police cars from the game following demonstrations about police brutality and structural racism. And something like removing police cars does matter. Representation does matter. But in a game, you're also thinking about mechanics, rules, and objectives. So how do you make those work with your alternative system? And there are a lot of games out there right, that are about anti-police issues. So games like Treachery in Beatdown City, which came out this year for the Switch, or Remain Silent, which is a smaller game about a well-intentioned police officer not being able to reform a police department because of an abundance of racial profiling and various other kinds of violent issues. But there are games too in which you're being asked to do something to organize a group of people, to act collectively, to balance different aspects of a community system. And those are games that might be worth trying out and practicing before figuring out where you want to focus in the way that Ashlyn's suggesting, on one issue, on one aspect of a complex system.
So kind of on the same vein, one thing that you're known for in the university community is making these alternate reality games, or ARGs. So can you kind of explain to our audience what ARGs are and the kind of games that you've created?
Ashlyn, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'll do a very kind of simplistic definition of an ARG, but they're what we call these transmedia experiences, that they don't stick to one specific form. Like if you have a video game, right, it's very screen-based. But what we're looking at is how we can tell a continuous narrative through multiple forms of media, right? So we're using social media. So we might have a Twitter or an Instagram page, or we might actually use, analog features of just calling a person on a phone, or we might post a picture or a poster on a hallway and hope that people look at it and see something strange, that maybe the date is actually like 100 years in the future, and see how many people might go to the website that's actually on that poster, right? And one of the things about an ARG is the fact that you all are playing almost as yourselves, right? This is like a different form of role play, we'd say, right? Where you're not necessarily playing as, a completely separate character, but you're playing as a version of yourself who is believing in this kind of different world, this alternate world that we have constructed for you. So that, a little definition of that. And so what we've worked on multiple alternate reality games, I think since 2012, 2013, Patrick. Go back couple years. And so we first started creating alternate reality games actually for high school students in Chicago public schools, focusing primarily on, STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, and math, also integrating humanities and artistic practices within that, and telling stories that, really hit home with the communities that we're working with. So our first game was The Source, where we actually were having a young girl who was trying to search for her father. And that was like a common kind of narrative for our students at that time. We then, in the next year, this was, I believe, 2013 and 2014, we created Project Seed. And so this one is where we started to, play off of the tropes of young adult fiction and science fiction, and pushing people into the future and saying that, hey, we can actually kind of talk to and communicate with the future, and creating these new kind of possibility spaces and trying to get young people to work together to make change for the future. And then, of course, that has led to, Parasite, a Labyrinth, and Terrarium. And Patrick, if you want to talk about those.
Yeah, with our more recent games since about 2017, we've really tried to take up specific issues at the University of Chicago and at other universities, and work with incoming undergraduate students on those. So our game, the Parasite, focused on issues of difference and diversity at the university. The game Terrarium focused on climate change, which is one of the biggest interdisciplinary problems and issues of our time. And then our game, A Labyrinth, focused on COVID-19 as it was unfolding in early 2020. So in each of those cases, we've had to very quickly respond to an issue that's live and try to work through that historical present in real time. And that brings interesting challenges, right? Because you're not planning for years and years and years. You're building on a design practice, but you're reading quickly, you're bringing in experts into the room, and you're taking all of that information and trying to turn it into a game that's engaging and also pushes people sometimes beyond their comfort zone so they can learn.
Absolutely. And can you kind of talk more about how you were saying you have to respond to things in kind of like live and basically, and I remember reading your book, Network Aesthetics, where you talked about more improvisational forms, that kind of benefits as opposed to more linear or multilinear forms. Can you kind of speak on that?
Sure. I mean, when we first started working on a labyrinth, we were basically seeing the very beginnings of COVID-19. We didn't yet realize quite how big of an issue it would become, but we knew immediately that students were being sent home for the spring, and there was a need for a quick connection between those students who wouldn't be able to see one another face to face, and there was a need to think about pandemics and how they impact social, political, and just everyday lives. And so we had less of a runway than we usually did to design, but within that time, we just tried to absorb as much information as possible, and also to create a game that asked the players to supply some of the details, so that we weren't just creating all of the narrative, all of the gameplay, but we were creating a series of quests that players could then populate with their own ideas and their own builds. So that made it more of a collaborative game, not just among the players, but between the players and the designers. So that's just one way. And I think part of what we're trying to say is, you can work on a video game, but the word game has come to mean so many things in 2020, right? It means interactive fiction oftentimes. It means platformer or first-person shooter video games. It means art games. It means alternate reality games, which don't use graphics in the conventional sense that we understand them. And all of these kinds of games, right, I mean, have in common that they're systems, players that engage in artificial conflict and lead toward objectives in one way or another. But they have all of these differences. So I think people working on this challenge really should be encouraged and are encouraged to go where their strengths lie as a team.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And I really want to draw that point out too, because like with the last couple of ARGs that we ran, we have people on our team that are more performance based, right, or work with live cinema, and you'll see that in our aesthetic if you looked at our videos on our website, which is fourcastlab.com, FOURCAST.com. But you can check out the design challenges there. You can check out the Twitch feed, and you can see those videos look distinctly different from some of our old alternate reality games, and that's just by virtue of the team. Our older team probably had more folks who were interested in writing out narratives and focusing on game mechanics, while our team currently is focused on theater and performance and cinema. So play towards your strengths, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know that I can definitely speak a little bit on Terrarium, because I was definitely part of y'all's team as an intern, and I know that it's definitely very important to recognize what your strengths are and capitalize on that, because when you have a team, you're collaborating with other people, and it's never about just one person doing everything. And so it's always best to just if you know that you can do something well, you can offer it up as something that you can work with, and then let people do their own thing, and then y'all come together to create one product. And I know that that's definitely kind of how we were able to work on Terrarium, because all the different interns were we had people who were more artistically inclined, or people who were very good with coding and programming and stuff like that. So it's definitely very important to just work together when you have these team-based projects.
Yeah, what you're saying, Hamlet, is really, really important, right? And Ashlyn and I, when we teach together too, something we emphasize to teams that are maybe designing together for the first time is don't just brainstorm and pitch your content or your form. Think about your collaborative style too, right? So it's worth having a conversation where you sit down and say, these are what I think are my strengths and my weaknesses when I work with other people, or here's the kind of thing that I think that I could contribute, or here's where sometimes I've had problems in the past. And it's hard to be honest and be in a space of vulnerability in that way. But oftentimes, if you can get that out up in front, you'll figure out a much better pipeline and a much better way of working together, and a better way of organizing yourselves, because so much about a game jam is being organized, not just having a good idea, but having the right kind of schedule and knowing when to fit in your piece and your strengths.
I guess one really broad question I have about ARGs is how do you kind of design ARGs specifically to tackle big problems? And I think a really great example is in Terrarium. The theme of climate change and tackling climate change was kind of thrown back at the audiences and saying like, okay, now it's your turn to create something innovative and something to kind of address the issue. So how do you kind of design something to have real life impacts?
Yeah, I mean, this is, for me, partially a question of audience, right? In making a game about post-police systems, who do you want to reach, right? Right, is this for people who like are already sold on the idea of defunding the police? That might be good, right? Because then it's like you all believe that police are not good in the form that they currently exist, or that police should be abolished in some cases. But you're trying to figure out what comes next. Or in other cases, are you trying to persuade people who don't believe that defunding the police is a good idea, right? That's a different looking kind of game. And so when we worked on the Terrarium alternate reality game, we started thinking about, like we thought a lot of our audience would believe that climate change is a real issue, but that people would be coming from different perspectives. So some people might have had more of a background in environmental science. Some might be more interested in political science and sociology and the policies that have to do with climate change. Still other people might really be into like sci-fi novels and imagining what the futures of climate change might look like. And so we wanted to make a game where people coming from all of those different perspectives could come in, and instead of just saying, hey, this is what we think about climate change, you need to absorb that right now, we wanted it to be more of a possibility space where a difficult conversation could take place. So that's one way of thinking about a game. A game isn't just a propaganda device, though there's sometimes nothing wrong with that. A game can also be a space for having a difficult conversation with people who have slightly different points of view.
Right.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think I definitely did want to go back to the point on kind of like managing time and scope, because I know that like both of you all have worked on like Chicago, we mentioned Terrarium, and we mentioned the Labyrinth. And I had a question about like, how can people like manage time and scope when creating projects that like address current events? And I think I thought about this question a lot because I like recently participated in like the Global Game Jam, which was 48 hours. And I'm like, I don't think I would be able to put like so much in like that's like happening in like the world right now, yet like and condense it and like put it in a product and like make it in 48 hours. But like our designers have like 2 weeks. And like while that brings like its benefits, it's also like a lot can happen in 2 weeks. So it like, yeah, I was wondering like what advice do you have on like managing that time and like using it the best that they can?
Yeah, well, like, when it takes a lot of time to design a game, right? Even like some of the smaller mobile games that we all play might have taken 3 to 6 months to even develop, right? So it takes time. And so when going into a global game jam, whether it's 48 hours or a design challenge that's 2 weeks long, I think something you have to kind of free yourself from this idea of I'm going to create something that is perfect and that is going to work, right? Like the moment that you go into a challenge thinking that that is actually something that you can achieve is the moment where I almost feel like you're setting yourself up for failure, right? Because then if things don't go perfectly, well, of course they weren't. Like how are you actually going to go and solve the entirety of the problems of defunding the police in 2 weeks or climate change in 2 weeks or like it's really hard, but it's not. But once you kind of free yourself from that of like it's not going to be perfect, that then frees you to be able to just kind of try something, try anything, right? And that's the space that you really need to be in when you're working on a design challenge. You need to be able to start kind of rapidly kicking out any ideas and just seeing where it leads us, right? You can't be afraid to fail because that's what you typically do in a game jam. And sometimes you create, because you're free from these ideas, you actually create even more interesting things or are able to think about problems even differently because you're no longer afraid of being perfect, right? So just don't think about being perfect. Try something, and even something that doesn't seem like it might be like the most amazing direction, just try it out, right? What's the harm in trying, right? And thinking through those mechanics and thinking through the social implications, like just free yourself from all of that.
I mean, one thing to add to that too is like in experimenting in the way that you're suggesting, Ashlyn, it's good to have a scope for what you're able to do within the period of time you have. We oftentimes talk about prototypes, like creating a prototype before you create a full game. In business speak, people would talk about a minimal viable product, for instance, right? Something that doesn't have all of the details and all of the cool audio and like detailed graphics that the final version might have, but where you can create something that's self-contained and gives people a vision of what it is that you're going for, something that works just barely, but gets the more important pieces, not the decorative elements, not the pieces that really pop, but the core of your idea that gets people excited. That might be one way to approach a game jam.
I remember I had attended a talk with both of you where one of the audience members asked a question about why your ARGs kind of don't focus around actual like facts and like teaching people things, and instead kind of focus on translating a different set of skills. Maybe that's a tough conversation. Maybe that's an actual like skill or kind of thing to do. What kind of structures do you have in place in your games to kind of facilitate that?
Yeah, like Efren and I have a lot of conversations about this, and like many people in the world, we're dissatisfied with the category of educational games, ones that are kind of like interactive quizzes or that just try to deliver information to you in a way that's often disconnected from gameplay. And sometimes, right, those kinds of games can feel very manipulative because it's basically like, okay, so now I know what the game designer thinks, but that hasn't changed my behaviors, that hasn't changed my attitudes or my habits in any way. And I think we decided that for the kinds of games that we make, we're less interested in changing people's hearts and minds. I mean, we do make games that I think are a little bit more focused, but we're more interested in raising difficult discussions. I don't know, Ashlyn, if you want to talk a little bit about how we try to go about that sometimes, like raising questions, but then also sustaining those conversations with our players in real time as the game is unfolding.
Yeah, so like for instance, I'll focus on Hexacago Health Academy actually. So it's like I love teaching high school students and I love teaching game design. So it's kind of my jam. And Patrick and I work closely on this project as well. So this is actually a program, a game design program, designed to teach high school students really about public health, but we get them to design their own games around a public health issue, right? And so again, it's that idea of we're not going to come with the problems on your community or the things that you like that, the literature says this is the issue with your community. We're going to say, you all, what do you notice is a problem? What do you feel is a public health issue? And why don't you design around that, right? So already the environment that we're providing for folks is much more like open, right? It's really about, providing a space for people to start bringing in issues that they want to talk about, right? And so I remember distinctly, like one of the groups, was wanting to have a game around teen pregnancy. And in the end, they created this game called Baby Town. And so in this game, what they were really trying to struggle with is the fact that like, oh, once you have a baby, your life is over, like full stop, right? Like that's what everyone says when you're a high school student. So, don't have sex, right? And so then this moment of like, okay, well, my goal is not to, say yes or no to that idea. It's really just to ask more questions and really dig down to like, what are you actually saying? What does this actually mean? And so then the question becomes that you pose back to the team is, well, do you see people who have babies in your classrooms? Yes, like their classmates still exist, right, in this current timeline. So we know that their life doesn't end, and now we can start to figure out what does that mean. And just asking clarifying questions, it really came down to this idea of, well, you're no longer as free as you used to be, right? You can't go to the movies when you want to, right? You can't spend your money the way that you want to. You can't hang out with your friends in the way that you want to, right? And so the life that has ended, right? That's the thing that they're really trying to get down to. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, okay, well, that's really interesting, right? And so how do we actually draw that out into your game, right? It's not about you draw a teen pregnancy card and then the game ends, right? What type of game experience is that for your players who, don't have, they aren't teen parents? And what does it mean for people who are teen parents to play your game, right? That's really harsh. Mm-hmm. But how do we actually go about and, vary up this kind of idea? Okay, well, what are the things that you have to balance as a high school student? What are the ways that you have to, if you had a baby, what are the things that you have to satisfy for your baby, as opposed to, dealing with friends and family and jobs, right? And so those are the ways that we started to just build up and kind of bring this tension out and really have them focus on their games. And so I would encourage other people, as you design your games, to really, really start having conversations with your team. And like, if things aren't clear with your statement, so, just defund the police, well, what does that mean to you, right? What does that mean to your team, right? And that might be different from how another team views that point, right? Or how anyone else views it. But as long as you all are clear about what it is that you're saying, then you can think about the rhetoric of the mechanics of your game.
One quick thing to add to this is, like a great piece of literature or a very effective game doesn't have to have all the answers, right? Like sometimes like articulating the right question is really hard and really productive, right? And figuring out, like Babytown, I think for me worked really well because it did simulate a system of like, what is your day? What is your week? What is your life like if you have a baby while you're in high school and it's unplanned? But it didn't say, as you're saying, Ashlyn, it didn't say this is bad. It just said, this is what the experience, the ups and downs of this experience might be like. And here are some of the questions that you might ask yourself. And so that's another way, is just to figure out what you don't know versus what you do know about an issue, in this case, post-police.
Awesome. So yes, I think we have like 4 minutes left, or about 4 minutes left, and I can ask like one last question, and then we can like wrap it up. But I know that like as one of your students, like I remember like my perspective shifted when I learned that like games are like operable media. Like it's unlike like books and like films, where like in games you can like play it and there are like rules that you can follow and rules that you can break. And there are like stories that are usually told by the game designers that can resonate with people. And you can like identify with these stories. And so I was wondering kind of like, what do you expect like the impact to look like as a result of designers like creating interactive media surrounding police abolition? And kind of just in general, like what do you expect to see like at the end of like the 2 weeks?
That's such a good question.
It's a great question. I mean, I would, here I would build on some stuff that Robert Vargas and Kelly Liu were saying in the last panel, which is kind of, and Ashlyn was saying a version of this as well, which is like, it's important not to obsess on the right answer, right? Like we live in a culture where people aren't allowed to fail in interesting ways. People fail all the time because of income inequality, because of racism, because of things that basically make the rules unfair to the majority of the population. But failure in terms of the kind of thing that you can like learn from is a privilege of a very few. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of patience in our culture. And so the idea is like, okay, so police don't work, try something else. And when you try something else, of course that thing isn't going to work right away. It's going to take generations to like make a system sufficiently strong that it can like minimize violence and make for a stronger society. But I think one of the great things about game design is it's an experimental form, and it allows you in very quick succession to try out a bunch of systems. And those systems aren't equivalent to what it would be like in the real world, but they're more than a thought experiment, right? A thought experiment is entirely in theory. A game actually has to work as a system that players are engaging in. So I would just say that the impact of these games is that they can allow us to experiment faster than we would in the real world, and with kind of a safety net, right? There's a safe failure that we often talk about with games, and I think that's a real benefit for trying to change the world fundamentally, as I hope the game designers who take place in this game jam will try to do, because that's really what's called for in this situation.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great point to end on, and I just want to encourage our participants to continue being experimental and be speculative, and we will be here to help along the way. Thank you so much to you both.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
you.
Hello, here we are. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma O'Hare. I'm a third-year college student and indie game creator. And I am here today with John R. Harness. He's a gay tabletop game designer and game critic in Chicago. He recently founded Knucklebones Magazine, which is an online journal for tabletop games discussion. He coined the phrase lyric game, and he's hosted popular game jams on Twitter and itch.io, including the Sad Mech Jam and the Tony Hawk Jam. John, thank you for being here with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been so fun listening to the talk today, getting to know you, getting to know a few other people involved in the design challenge. Great fun. Before we go any further, I want to say, fuck the police.
Fuck the police.
Yeah. They suck a lot.
Yeah, it's been a couple of months.
It's been a global history of policing is what it's been.
Truly, it has been.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many places that we could start. But in the Discord last night, you were posting so many interesting resources and links, and the one that really caught my attention was Robert Yang's game Tea Room.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering if we could start by talking about some of the really powerful kind of baked-in mechanics that Tea Room uses to kind of reflect the like lived reality of queer people who are facing police brutality.
Sure. Listen, I think that's a good question. You should ask Robert Yang that question. I don't know a ton about his game, but the reason I shared that bit is because Robert Yang is a game designer who works in New York. He's a gay man, and he has worked very directly on the idea of police have brutalized queer people in really direct ways over the years, and that game Tea Room references a specific event in which a public restroom was raided and a bunch of gay men were arrested, and that's one instance of many instances of police violence against queer people and gay men specifically. And just like the pitch of why that game is cool is because it's a game in which you're sort of you're put in the place of a gay man cruising in this bathroom. You are trying to have sex with the men around you, but some of them are cops, and so the challenge is like, you want to look at them so that you can cruise them, but if you look too much and if it's the wrong person, they might arrest you. So it's taking this kind of snapshot of gay life as sort of gay as outlaw and put it into a game. And there's tons to talk about that game. All the dicks are guns, for example. There's a whole bunch. I think another resource that I shared recently that I'd like to center a little bit more, just because it's been really informing my own thinking a lot, is an article I read recently in Vogue magazine by a black trans activist named Tourmaline. And the concept that they shared comes out of the world of freedom schools and other kind of alternative education systems, as far as I know. And the idea is freedom dreaming. It's this idea of asking yourself questions and asking again and sort of deeply rooting yourself down into the what ifs of a certain question. And the questions include things like, what from the dominant culture do we want to get rid of? What from the dominant culture do we want to keep? What could we imagine that we want that we don't have? And that has just been rattling around in my brain, because the content that Tourmaline in this piece talks about is like, yeah, I'm doing freedom dreaming when I dye my hair in the bathroom. I'm imagining alternate realities, right? And not only dreaming them, but I'm living into them, right? When I take a deep breath and imagine myself with my friends, I am imagining what a utopia of sorts could look like. And the reason I want to bring this up is the other panelists have been saying great things about, thinking through like, how might we change the system? How might we be sort of practical? How might games be usable to sort of educate or bring up conversations and things like that. And I think that's wonderful. And I just want to raise another option, which is game design as freedom dreaming, game design as imagining other worlds, and not just like imagining how we could get rid of police, but imagining a world just where there aren't any police, and then saying, okay, my game is set there. Look, it's a game. There's no police. I'm imagining a post-police world, and I think that's so powerful in a very particular way. To link that to game design more specifically, I think everybody who's interested in this game jam should look at the work of Avery Alder, who's a tabletop designer who works a lot in sort of the world of imagining alternate realities with a sort of activist bent. She produced a game called Dream Askew, and that inaugurated the Belonging Outside Belonging framework, which is all about imagining groups of marginalized people living, with sort of conflict, and that conflict might be the police, but the idea is like, it's not about we're going out on adventures to fix a problem, we're living together in community and what comes out of that. Okay, so that's the background. Alder uses a phrase, idle dreaming, as I think a really powerful part of this game design framework. Idle dreaming is just naming and making a part of the process the idea of, we're just friends sitting around a table playing a game right now, and we're not sure what we want to do in our game, so let's just think about it and just come up with ideas, right? And I think this is so powerful, both in a game, what's at the center of our anarchist queer commune? Is it a statue? Is it a food bank? What is it? Let's just dream. And similarly, okay, we've got an anarchist food bank. What does society look like? What doesn't it look like? What is it like when I go in my bathroom and dye my hair blue? All that stuff. So those are just the thoughts that have been roaring in my own head for the last few days in thinking about this. The idea of freedom dreaming and using game design as a way to not necessarily tackle or do planning in a sort of political scientist kind of way, but to do dreaming in the same way that like fan fiction is dreaming, or slice of life anime is dreaming, or other stuff like that,
That's amazing. I think this game jam, it leaves so much room for that kind of dreaming, but I think it can be so intimidating to approach this, because I think a lot of people might think like, oh shit, like if I want to join this, I have to know what a future without police looks like, or a world that has never had police looks like. But I think the real power here is that people can create games that are structured around questions, like kind of what Patrick and Ashlyn were saying, like it's about asking the right questions. Do you like have any tips for people who are trying to like make a game with a question at the heart of it?
Apparently not.
It's a hard question.
I'm also quite interested in the idea of designing with an emotion in mind, or designing with a feeling in mind. I wrote a game. Okay, trigger warning. I'm gonna use a historically anti-gay slur because it's in the title of a game I designed. The game is called Us Faggots Kill Fascists. I wrote this the night that Donald Trump was elected. It's about going out with your queer gang, your faggot gang, and murdering a bunch of fascists. That's what it's about, right? I didn't really go into that game design with a question. I went into that game design with rage and anger and a desire to sort of reclaim a kind of violence I don't have access to normally, right? And I think there's a big movement in indie tabletop RPG design right now that's I think less about asking questions or trying to answer questions and more about pursuing this kind of emotive space. I think. What do you think about it?
I mean, definitely like reading through that game for myself, like a huge part of it is like a cathartic release. Like it feels like kind of when you get to the end of that game, it feels like there's been like this release. It's like this both an adrenaline rush kind of because of the content, but also just like finally you kind of get to occupy and actualize a space that is in the realm of dreaming, sort of. Really.
I wrote another game called Welcome to Paradise Baby, which is about anonymous glory hole cocksucking, right? And again, this is less about me having a question and more about me being like, I think this is super fun, and I think that my friends would think it's super fun, but some of my friends don't have penises, and some of my friends can't access places where there are glory holes. So let me share via this, right? And maybe you could frame that as a question. What would it be like if my friend and roommate played a game, was involved in anonymous glory hole cocksucking? I guess so, but it was more like just an impulse to share,
Yeah. So you've been at the helm of a lot of game jams, and I'm sure you've like received a lot of submissions that kind of run the gamut from like this kind of question based to just like catharsis or like basing around a certain emotion. But are there any specific like shared traits or anything that you think makes submissions to a jam successful? And I know this could be kind of different for every person that accesses them, but in your opinion, what have made some of the submissions to your jams really, really impactful for you?
I think a jam in a way is kind of its own mode of dreaming, as I discussed, right? And so I think game jams, as Ashlyn a few moments ago was talking about, this is a place to just sort of pump out a bunch of ideas, pursue an idea and do it. I would sort of quibble with one of Ashlyn's points, which was to sort of the idea of like stick with one thing, try and work on a thing and get it to work well. That's perfectly good advice, and I agree with it most of the time. But also, like, what if you made like 50 games and you gave yourself an hour to do it all, and then you just submitted it? That's, I think, the power of game jams, is how sort of instant they can be. So I think when things are powerful for me in a game jam, they are they really take one thing and they do sort of present it. But the reason I'm struggling with this is because, like, I don't know that I sit around thinking like, wow, this is a really powerful game jam or game submission, because I think of game jams as a flood of things, right? It's like asking which of the molecules of water in this wave is really hitting me, right? My experience of game jams is that it's this big wave of stuff, and normally in game jams, I think that the game kind of gets away from you in a really awesome and productive way. It will change. I ran a game called the Troika Backgrounds Jam, which was Troika is a particular sort of adventure game, and it's really easy to make kind of backgrounds for characters. You can do it on an index card, and so because of that, another designer and I threw this thing, and we asked people like, go read Troika, play Troika, and then come up with backgrounds. Well, one thing that happened totally unexpected for us was that some people in the kind of indie scene had never read Troika, and were like, wow, this jam looks really cool, but I haven't read Troika and I don't really feel like reading Troika. What if I just read all the other submissions, decide what I think a Troika background looks like, and then write that? And then that became a trend within the jam itself. It became people iterating, simulating simulacra of what they believed a Troika background to be, to this place where it got totally wild and off the wall. And so, like, yeah, I can say like, hey, I kind of like this entry and I kind of like that entry. That has less to do with some grand game design advice I can give you, and more just like stuff I like. Is there a hot dude on the cover? I probably like that one, Is there like a weird witch? I think that one's cool, right? That's idiosyncratic and subjective. But I think game jams, so much of their power and what I remember about them, qua jams, comes from the way that they change and people are interacting with each other. And then you, at the other side of a game jam, you're like, whoa, what happened?
I really love the idea of like a game jam is just kind of like this deluge of ideas, and like the individuals being part of a whole. I think that can be really really powerful for people who have never been part of a jam before. I think there might be a lot of pressure to create like, your kind of like magnum opus, but I love this idea of like, let's just figure out 50 ideas and like, let's throw them out. And like you said, like other people might latch onto that. Maybe they'll hack your game. Maybe they'll hack your idea, that kind of thing. That's really amazing. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Let's dream together. What do you imagine is going to come out of post-police design challenge?
First, all of my friends are going to be very tired of me posting on Facebook begging them to try game design for the first time. I don't know. I personally really see, like, I imagine that I will be extremely, like, I imagine that my preconceptions and my vision of like what a post-police future is going to be like significantly challenged. And I'm excited to like have all of my preconceived notions of what people generally might think about police. Like I think that'll be, I'm excited for both for me and for other people, for all this to just be a tool to kind of challenge our thoughts and our, like, what we're bringing to the table.
Cool. I like that you're thinking of your own subjective experience moving through this wave and thinking, what will I have learned on the other side?
Yeah. I think it's really amazing that, like, we're all making these plans to come together and like share with each other very openly, and like what could be like a very personal way, our own experiences, and just being ready to just put it out there and let it touch people how it's going to touch people.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that the kind of the sensation of having a jam kind of move away from you and become bigger than what you intended it to be. I'm hoping to experience that for myself.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm thinking about the ways, I think about all these friends who you think are tired of you posting about stuff. I get that. But also, like, think about it. Like, one of those friends might discover game design and get really into it. And then, I'm thinking about you and the other organizers of the jam who haven't really correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't really super engaged with, like, say, the Twitter game design community or even the itch design community, right? Yeah. And this is a way for you all to really engage with that, make connections, and then like a year from now, I think you'll look back at this and say like, wow, this is when I met a bunch of people. I think in my game design life, I went to a particular conference years ago, and that's when like I met a bunch of people, and now I think like, okay, who are the people in that room, and who did they introduce me to? And like, wow, that's like my game design world like exploded out of that room of people. And I think, I'm dreaming about what this game design challenge might be like for you and your collaborators and everyone who participates,
right.
Linking up with communities, forming your own communities. I mean, you founded a game design collective. Congrats.
Thank you.
Hell yeah.
I think the best advice that like we got about that was from you, where you basically said like, oh, you're a group of people, like give yourselves a funny name, and you hit the ground running. Like I've found that it's a lot easier to kind of integrate yourself and like start getting to know people in this community than a lot of people would think it is. Like everyone is, just by the nature of like what game design is, I think everyone's very willing to like step forward and be like, oh, let me help you, let me share things with you, let me share myself with you. And I think that's really, there's a lot of power in that.
Hell yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Gosh, I'm overwhelmed by how much dreaming and talking that we have done. So if we're thinking about like, all these friends of mine who are coming to the game design table, and we've been saying all these things like, oh, think about questions, like think about like making a bunch of ideas. But do you have any tips for like what is like the best point of entry? Is it like hacking another game that you like? Is it just sitting with a blank document and starting writing out ideas? Like what do you think for the person with zero experience? Like what's the best point of entry here?
Yeah, great question. I would say primarily the answer is that there's no bad way to do it.
Right.
Look around you, what resources do you have? What resources could you get for yourself? Start where you are, and don't overthink that. That being said, hacking a game, by which we mean taking a pre-existing game and sort of modifying it in a way, is very powerful and has gotten a lot of people into game design, especially in the last few years. And there are several games like Takuma Okada's Alone Among the Stars, I'm thinking of, for example, that is just a game that's like essentially like it's very powerful in its own right, but also it's relatively easily hackable, similar with what I was saying about Troika earlier. And so finding one of those games, finding a community of people who are working specifically in that game can be very, very, very useful and a way to kind of, get started. I would also say that there exist in the world, and I hope to make more of them and get more people to make them, templates. A good template, that'll save your life. And I mean, it's so easy to like, you have this blank notebook and you're like, okay, what do? I have all these ideas. Oh my gosh, okay, I'm dyeing my hair in the bedroom and I'm having sex with somebody and there's no cops. Okay, like how do I fit all that in? Find a template and like it will make it smaller and more manageable for you. And by templates, I mean like, for a lot of indie game designers in tabletop land right now are using a free program called Canva, canva.com, Canva. It's just like the world's easiest online Photoshop analog, right? It's super easy, you can get in. So that's just easy to use. But then find templates. You can get, what's it called? It's not Adobe Photoshop. Affinity Publisher right now is on sale for like $30. That's not accessible to everybody, but it's more than the $90 that Photoshop is on a recurring basis, right? So find those things, find templates for them, and start.
Yeah, kind of like things that can funnel the big ideas into like something that's actually on the paper, right?
Yeah.
That is wonderful. Yeah. Do you have any last thoughts, any last parting words before we have to end this wonderful stream?
Yeah, thanks you guys so much for doing all this work. Fuck the police again, say it every day. And, let's just draw our minds to the people who are continually suffering and have been killed by police violence, both recently and historically. Let's think about the imperialist violence done by the United States and the violence of capitalism. Let's bring all that to mind, and then let's like jump off the high dive into a game design challenge and see what we can dream about.
Absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time and your energy.
Thank you.
I am going to give everyone a couple of dates and things for the challenge before we wrap up. So the challenge starts proper on July 13th, which is this Monday. It will run for 2 weeks until the 24th. So that is kind of our main kind of bulk period that people will be producing games. You can find the link to our itch.io with more information. After the 24th, after that 2-week period, we will have a feedback session with some of our amazing people that we've been working with. That feedback session will happen on July 27th, a couple days after the jam sort of ends. There'll be time to refine and make your games whatever you can dream them to be. We really, really want to thank everyone for watching, and thank you for supporting our jam and being here. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. Best of luck to everyone who is planning on making submissions. We cannot wait to hear all of your ideas. So thank you so much for everything, and have a wonderful day.